Welcome to Volusia County Schools Sexual Harassment Training. For the next few minutes, you will be presented with information on sexual harassment and harassment in the workplace, and what to do if you find yourself in this predicament. By law, an employer must have a written anti-sexual harassment policy and an annual anti-sexual harassment training. You are now participating in our annual training. To make sure we have our legal requirements covered, we have several policies that touch on sexual harassment and harassment based on other protected classes. Policy 507 is our non-discrimination and educational equity policy. It speaks directly to sexual harassment and also includes sexual orientation. Policy 509 is our prohibition of harassment policy. This is a more detailed policy that includes definitions, examples, reporting procedures, the investigation process, and retaliation. This policy also includes sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or expression. Policy 525 is our bullying and harassment policy. This policy is really geared more towards bullying. However, it does speak of harassment. This policy goes into great detail of the investigative process as well as possible consequences. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 is a federal law prohibiting sex discrimination and sexual harassment in educational programs or activities that receive federal funds. Under Title IX, every Volusia County school employee is a mandatory reporter of sexual harassment once they have actual knowledge that sexual harassment occurred or might have occurred. So what is sexual harassment? Sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and/or other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that explicitly or implicitly affects an individual's employment, unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance, or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. Sexual harassment can appear as jokes, offensive comments during a conversation, through emails and/or text messages, and obviously physical contact. Additionally, sexual harassment can occur outside the normal workplace office. Such areas include at sporting events, while traveling to and from different work sites, work parties, or gatherings outside of campus or at conferences. Now let's talk about the who. Most people believe sexual harassment can only occur in a supervisory relationship. That is simply not true. Sexual harassment can also occur with coworkers, parents, vendors, and indirect victims. An example of an indirect victim could be a person who may be walking by when an inappropriate joke or comment is made. That unintended person who heard the joke or comment has now become an indirect victim. Sexual harassment not only hurts the victim, but it can hurt everyone involved. Sexual harassment can cause an increase in absences, a reduction in productivity, lower morale, and interpersonal conflicts among coworkers. There are two forms of sexual harassment: quid pro quo harassment and hostile work environment. Quid pro quo harassment means this for that. It is when someone in power, usually a supervisor, demands a sexual favor in exchange for a benefit or not imposing a negative consequence. Hostile work environment is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that is so severe and pervasive that it negatively or severely impacts an employee's ability to do their job. So what should you do if you find yourself the victim of harassment? You should report the behavior immediately to your principal, supervisor, or the Office of Professional Standards. Employers must act immediately if they know about sexual harassment. The Professional Standards webpage has a simple one-page report that makes it easy for you to report harassment and discrimination. After you make a report, what can you expect? First, there will be an investigation as policy dictates. First, one must determine if legal sufficiency exists, meaning if what was reported is proven, did it violate a policy? One can expect personal interviews with all parties involved, the collection of any evidence, such as video evidence, photos, or screenshots, And once the investigation is completed, it will be presented to the Professional Standards Committee and/or superintendent for review and appropriate action. Now let's go through some scenarios. Please take a moment to think about each scenario. Is it sexual harassment, and how would you handle it? Scenario number 1. A teacher approaches you with a problem, but tells you that before she shares the concern with you, she does not want you to say anything. When she does share, the concern is that she is receiving unwelcome sexual advances from her principal, but then asks you to promise not to say anything to anyone. Is this sexual harassment? Can you promise not to say anything, or must you report the behavior? Unwelcome sexual advances are a form of sexual harassment, and under Title IX, you are a mandatory reporter and must report the principal's behavior immediately. Scenario number 2. Whenever you are together with your peers for monthly training, you hear one coworker making rude comments about another coworker's sexual orientation. While the coworker who is the victim of the comments does not say anything, the comments continue each time you get together. Is this sexual harassment, and how would you handle the situation? Making rude or insensitive comments about a person's sexual orientation is sexual harassment, and it is a violation of School Board Policy 509. The coworker's comments should be reported to a supervisor immediately. Scenario number 3. You find out your department supervisor is sleeping with your married coworker. You ask your coworker about the affair, and he tells you he has been promised a promotion at the end of the school year in exchange for the office romance. Is this sexual harassment, and what should you do? This scenario demonstrates quid pro quo sexual harassment, since the supervisor is promising a promotion in exchange for sexual favors. You should report the affair and what you know immediately to the Office of Professional Standards. Now let's talk about retaliation. It's important to know that victims of harassment or those who report harassment can do so without fear of retaliation. School Board Policy 509 protects against any individual who reports alleged harassment. So when is it retaliation? Retaliation can happen after someone opposes sexual harassment, reports or files a complaint, or participates as a witness in a sexual harassment investigation. Examples of retaliation can include a demotion or termination, a denial of a promotion, threats, a negative evaluation, a change in assignment or schedule, and exclusion from meetings. This concludes Volusia County Schools sexual harassment training. Please feel free to contact the Office of Professional Standards at the number below should you have any questions following this presentation. Thank you for your time and attendance.